the one-room schoolhouse, which is out on Finley Road in Danville, and it represents a school that was in operation in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. Beverly, how late did that school actually run?
Well, the school was built in 1889, and then a family from Tassajara that had a lot of children moved, and they didn't have enough students to keep the school open, so it closed in 1946.
1946. So it was in operation for quite a while, and it is now being used for third graders to come and experience what school was like in a one-room schoolhouse in the 1800s. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we've had to shut that program down as well. But as soon as things open back up,
well, good afternoon to another episode of Candid Conversations. And today we have two very special guests joining me. One of them is Brad Blackwell. He is a retired, that's the key word, Executive Vice President of Wells Fargo and now the President of the Museum of San Ramon Valley. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Aparna.
And we have Beverly Lane. I think everyone knows Beverly Lane with her East Bay Regional Park District hat, but she wears several hats, and one of them is the Vice President of the Museum of San Ramon Valley, an author, a historian, was a former mayor council member of the town of Danville, and now we're going to ask Beverly how she manages to do that.
Well, you know, I've been managing several things for some time, and what I discovered when I had the empty nest of the children going on was that I could manage more things. So I think I would just say my life is in file folders, and that's how I keep track of things.
And that's a good way. And that's a good way to manage life. And Brad, so we understand Beverly has been involved in history for a while and has been writing books and stories about our valley. How does a former executive fit into history and museums?
Well,
tell us a little bit about that.
Before I answer that, I'll just tell you that Beverly is being very modest because most of the history of the San Ramon Valley is right in her head. You pretty much just have to ask her a question and she'll tell you the answer. As far as my involvement, I've been involved with the museum just for the last 3 years, and it has a lot to do with just wanting to give back to the community, and the museum itself being the keeper of the history of the San Ramon Valley just helps bring the community together, and it's something that has been appealing to me.
And how has it been for you and for Beverly during the pandemic when everything has been shut down? Does a museum function in a pandemic world?
Yeah, unfortunately, we had to close when shelter in place began, and we've had a few opportunities to, hints that maybe we were able to open, and those were retracted as cases in San Ramon and Danville continued to increase. So we are not open, although Beverly does show up on Saturdays and brings the, I'll let you talk a little bit about bringing the women's suffrage exhibit outdoors so that people can take a look at it.
And we are going to talk about women's suffrage later in this interview, but I want you to share your interesting backgrounds that you have. And I know we are not in those areas right now, but Brad, if you can talk about your background, I mean the virtual background, not your background, but what do you have there?
I am sitting in front of the one-room schoolhouse, which is out on Finley Road in Danville, and it represents a school that was in operation in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. Beverly, how late did that school actually run?
Well, the school was built in 1889, and then a family from Tassajara that had a lot of children moved, and they didn't have enough students to keep the school open, so it closed in 1946.
1946. So it was in operation for quite a while, and it is now being used for third graders to come and experience what school was like in a one-room schoolhouse in the 1800s. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we've had to shut that program down as well. But as soon as things open back up, third graders will be flocking here for their field trips to learn about education in the 1800s.
So what is the most interesting feedback you get from the third graders about the one-room school? Is there something that stands out in memory for both of you?
Yeah, first, all three of my daughters experienced that program, and my middle daughter, Katie Cummings, is a third grade teacher, and she takes her kids now there on field trips, and they love the games. I think they get a name that might be appropriate to the era. They see the clothes, and they just seem to really enjoy the fact that it's a different world that people lived in for school at the time.
And it's always fun. So Beverly, what are your memories from students sharing?
Well, the Tassajara School has a very strict curriculum. And I think what is a shocker to them is they separate the boys and the girls. They're put in a line. When they talk to the teacher, they have to do their manners. And the teachers, who are all volunteers, really enjoy it because they'll see these students like in the grocery store, and they'll come and curtsy and say, "Oh, Mistress Kurtz." And my favorite letter from a child said, this is my favorite field trip anywhere except for Disneyland.
Oh, that's quite a compliment.
Right up there.
Yeah, it's right up there.
Yeah.
One of the things, I grew up spent a lot of my childhood in boarding schools, and corporal punishment was always a part of it. Was that a part of the one-room school program ever, historically speaking?
You go ahead, Ben.
I don't know. Our main punishment is having a child put his or her nose on the blackboard in the middle of a circle.
And by the way, I had to do that when I was in elementary school, so that practice hasn't been abandoned for too long.
And do you think that solves all problems, or is it just one of the more interesting elements to disciplining?
The putting your nose in the circle? No, I doubt that it solves very many problems at all.
Okay. Before we talk about the Museum of San Ramon Valley, I want Beverly to talk about her virtual background. What are we seeing in it, Beverly?
Oh, this is a summer picture of what will be the new park in central Contra Costa. Right now we call it the Concord Hills Regional Park, but in a couple of months it will probably have a new name. So you're looking at the grasslands of the central part of Contra Costa and Concord.
So we are essentially looking at East Bay Regional Park District making history through a virtual background. It was a lot of work getting that. So let's talk about the Museum of the San Ramon Valley. Brad, if you can give us an insight for residents who are new, what is something they should be looking at and how can they get involved? What are some elements about the museum?
Sure. Well, the museum itself, the main part of the museum is in the old Southern Pacific Railroad Depot. It's at the corner of Railroad and Prospect Avenues in downtown Danville. And I would encourage, once things open back up, people to come and take a look. In the old freight room, there's a permanent exhibit that goes around the outside that has a lot of history and artifacts from the San Ramon Valley since the time Native Americans were here and all the way up to times within the last 100 years. So that's interesting. And then there's a rotating exhibit that comes through that could do anything from right now sitting in there is wildflowers here in California that emerge every spring. I remember a time about 3 or 4 years ago that they had an exhibit on the influence of the Tule Lake internment camp that the Japanese were sent to, and talked about some of the impacts for San Ramon Valley residents that were shipped off to internment camps. The reason that that one was important was my mother spent 4 years when she was a little girl in Tule Lake internment camp. When I told her about it, she had to come up from Arizona. Within a couple of weeks, she wanted to come see it. And the impact on her was tremendous. And the reason I tell you that story is that there are a lot of exhibits that come through that are relevant for all of the residents of the San Ramon Valley.
That must have been quite a moment to have to relive and go through those things. Beverly, can you add something to what Brad said? With these exhibits coming in, they are obviously very unique to the character of San Ramon Valley. What is the process you use as an insight for all of us to select what are we going to showcase in a particular month? What do you look at?
Well, what we try to do is bring museum exhibits there that reflect California and the San Ramon Valley, and sometimes national. So we've had them on the Civil War and Lincoln. We had a large one on cowboys and cattlemen. We've had gold rush exhibits. And we have a committee that sits down and tries to plan a couple of years ahead, and then puts them up for 2 to 3 months. Then in the fall, we always have had an exhibit on the California Indians, because they were here for thousands of years, and we feel like people need to know more about them. And then at the December period, we always have something called Christmas Memories, with a whole variety of things, trees, trains, and have a little celebration like that. It's we have many more exhibits than most local history museums, and it is we really rely on our volunteers.
So now, do you and Brad or the board decide the exhibits? Do you take community input, like what they want to see, what they are interested in seeing again, maybe bringing that exhibit back? Is there a process for that also?
There's not really a process, but there's plenty of people that tell us that.
and we listen to what the community is telling us. Sure. You know, an interesting exhibit that Beverly was very involved in last year was about the 1960s, and it showed what the San Ramon Valley was like in the 1960s. It was very, very interesting, and that one had a lot of community response. A lot of people came because they wanted to see what was going on with the 1960s in that era.
And one of the things I can say safely is we didn't have as much traffic on our homes back in the 60s. So fascinating history. I agree, that part, that chapter. And I think that's what brings people into the museum, because they want to learn about the history of the region. What age group do you look at, the more interested ones, when you're putting out an exhibit? Do you study those patterns, demographics, age groups? Is that a consideration for the museum?
No, and I think it's more, it's really more qualitative than quantitative. You know, there's also an excellent traveling, there's a agency that does traveling museums exhibits, like it's called Exhibit Envoy. And we often look at what they have as a basic exhibit, and we will bring it in and then supplement it to have it reflect what is happening in the San Ramon Valley. For example, the Tule Lake exhibit that Brad mentioned, we took the opportunity to bring Japanese Americans who had lived here before they went to the Gila River internment camp to come back. and there were lots of reunions there. So we do a combination of things. If we do an exhibit that's an original one for us, that is a tremendous amount of work, and it takes probably 18 months to do something like that. So we look for interesting exhibits to come from elsewhere, and sometimes we've had the Smithsonian exhibits. So we're very proud of what we are able to offer, and would love to have more people come.
And yes, and that would be a very big effort to get many more people involved, which is what my next question was going to be. Brad, as the president, you know there is Forest Home Farms in San Ramon. How much of a partnership is envisioned moving forward, combining the two histories, I mean the two cities and the history? There is obviously San Ramon Valley Museum is in Danville, and Forest Home Farms is here. How do you see your vision in how we align?
Well, so keep in mind that while the museum building itself is located in Danville, its mission is to reflect the history of the entire San Ramon Valley, and that includes San Ramon. So, for example, much of the 60s exhibit included historical items from San Ramon itself. And there's a tremendous partnership with people in San Ramon, and we're very interested in ensuring that our volunteers and our exhibits reflect the needs and history of the San Ramon, as well as Danville and Alamo.
So if it comes to doing events together, you are open to that approach if it brings more people to seeing the exhibits or the events, whatever is planned.
Yes.
So I know you have to leave, but if there is, and let's tell the viewers who are probably going to wonder where you're leaving, you're off to a wonderful trip, but let's talk about your vision personally for the museum, and also what you're looking for in terms of community support.
Sure. So two things. On the near term, because the museum has been closed, there's tremendous financial pressure on the museum. It's don't think that it's so much that it will cause any long-term problems, but certainly there are short-term financial needs, and anything that we can do to get financial support in the form of donations from residents of the community, we will tremendously appreciate that, since our revenue sources are largely gone today. For the long term, our objective is to continue to increase participation and visitation by residents of the community, and we'll do that both by getting more people involved and engaged, and secondly, by providing exhibits and activities and programs that are attractive and interesting to the residents of the San Ramon Valley. And so my vision is that we continue to do that, and Beverly over the years has done an amazing job of taking the history and bringing it to life, and we will continue to do that type of work.
So the particular challenge that we do face from the museum is that we own the Tassajara School and property that's in back of Brad, and we own the depot. So we own two of the oldest historic buildings that are still intact. And in order to take care of older buildings, there are always challenges. You know, for Forest Home Farms, they are very happily a park for the city of San Ramon. And so the city can decide just how many resources to put in there, but they have that basic support from San Ramon, whereas for us in these two buildings, we rely on the entire community to understand the values and to support us.
Which is why community involvement and effort becomes so important, especially in times like this. Brad, before you leave, there is one question I have to ask you. I always ask people who are involved with history and museums and are working or volunteering. Do you believe in ghosts? And do you think there is a ghost there in that one room schoolhouse?
I'm not necessarily a believer in ghosts. And I haven't come across any in the one-room schoolhouse or in the railroad depot. But if I do, I will let you know.
There you have it. It's a ghost-free environment, and everyone should go and visit these and donate to the museum any which way, time, money, effort to help keep this precious gem alive in our community and the history alive. Thank you so much, Brad. We're going to continue the conversation with Beverly now, and we wish you all the best on your trip.
Thank you, Aparna.
Thank you.
Take care and take care. You're in good hands with Beverly here.
I
Bye-bye.
know that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Let's discuss what you are wearing, the sash. Can you tell us what that is?
All right. Well, this year is the centennial of women winning the vote in the country. And one of the things that women did before 1920 was they marched in parades. And the traditional garb came to be white dresses with a sash. So I have one of the sashes on, and it says votes for women with purple and gold colors. So I got this, this is a new sash. This is not a historic sash, but this was what people wore there, and this is what they wore when they picketed the White House as the first group ever to picket the White House.
Is that why the attire is white? What is the reasoning behind the white attires?
Well, the white dress, I think, really reflects what was a dress that every woman would have had in that era. And they were usually white cotton. And I think they figured out how to keep them white. And so it made it an easy matter. They didn't have to go out and get a new garment.
And what is the specialty between with the purple and the gold? Was there any reasoning, or just looked good?
You know, they always had a reason for the different colors, and I can't remember offhand. One was fidelity, and
I thought it was going to be royalty, because aren't those the royal colors, that purple and gold?
Yeah, no, they were more things from the heart.
Okay, well, let's talk about this whole journey. It was a 72-year journey before anything was attained, and it was very an arduous journey. It was a lot of women putting in a lot of time. Can you share some stories about this journey and how we got there?
Certainly. So what I found interesting as I was studying about it was that when the Declaration of Independence was adopted in 1776, of course, women were not included, as the votes were quite restricted. They were white men who owned property. You know, that it was a restriction then. And but it really took 72 years from then to the time that women put together a convention in 1848. And we count that date as the date of the beginning of this effort to win the vote for women. And that took place in a church in Seneca, New York, where several women, many of them Quakers, and many of them part of the abolitionist movement, got together and talked about women's rights as well. So when you talk about civil rights, there are rights for different races and different sexual orientations. And at that point, they were talking civil rights for enslaved Africans. And at this meeting, they started talking about women's rights. And what was true at that point was if you were a woman and married, you essentially became a non-person. One of the judges said that when a man and woman marry, they become one person, and that person is the man. And so you lost any of the rights you had as a single woman. You couldn't keep your own earnings, you couldn't own property. your husband could beat you with impunity, and you were unable, if you had an inheritance, to keep any control over that. And so women of, particularly out of the abolitionist movement and Quakers, said this simply shouldn't continue to exist in a country such as America, which said they believed in equal rights for all. So at this convention, the woman who was the brains of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, put together a declaration of sentiments in which she said, she revised the Declaration of Independence to say all men and women are created equal. And then she had a list of grievances, which were pretty powerful, which everyone at the meeting agreed on, except for one. And she said women should have the vote. So that was so radical. People said, oh no, you know, if we say that, people will start making fun of us. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, oh, well, that's what you need in order to be a full citizen. And she was supported by a very prominent Black American at that point, Frederick Douglass, who was an orator and an abolitionist. And so that passed at that Seneca Falls. So that was when it started.
A
And
very difficult era to be in when you are
was.
not considered important.
Yeah.
So
Elizabeth met Susan B. Anthony a couple of years afterwards, and the two of them were really the lead suffragists for all of the country through the 19th century. We all know Susan B. Anthony.
Yes, and she was here in San Francisco and Martinez giving speeches.
Yeah.
I wonder what she was taking for her throat, because I read that she was one of these people who was out there with her messaging. Now, a very interesting part of this, as I was reading and researching, was a car that they used, a tour car. Tell us about that, why that was used by the women, and how did it help?
Well, you know, it's interesting you said that about her voice, because women were not allowed to speak in public in the mid-19th century. And then with the women's movement, they started speaking. Another thing that was quite outrageous. But Susan B. Anthony chose not to marry. And she became the spokeswoman, and she traveled all over the country. She had a voice that carried. And so she came to California in the 19th century when we had a vote on it. And she encouraged women not to be shy about speaking. And so one of the things that happened with California's suffrage, and also the one effort in Washington State, was this was the start of the 20th century, and cars, and particularly luxury cars like a touring car, very interesting to everybody. And so what they decided for the women's suffrage in California was to take one of these cars and drive, and then they would stop where there was a group of men, and the woman would stand up in the car and give a suffrage speech. And of course, the men came to look at the car initially, and then they got to hear the speech. And in California, the women were just very careful about it. I mean, they weren't like adversarial. They were, you know, you would want your mother and your daughters and your mother and your wife to vote. And that's what we need to have you vote on. And they took this car through the Central Valley, where they got a lot of essential votes as well. So they called it the Blue Liner, and it was their touring car to draw men voters.
So not only were these women educated and enlightened, but they were also using very practical approaches to getting their message out. They knew what would bring the men out to listen to their messaging. Yeah. Now, a first set of efforts failed. There were powerful liquor dealers. Mm-hmm. What was the relation there? Why were they not supportive of this effort?
Well, because water was not exactly clean all the time, a lot of people felt if you were going to drink something, you needed to drink something alcoholic. So but of course that's not the only reason why they drank, but that was one element. And what happened was that's drinking was an essential part of life for so many men and some women. And for a lot of women who were involved in trying to get rights for married women, they were concerned that men would come home drunk and beat their wife and family and spend their money in the bars. And so there was a huge women's Christian temperance union movement to get rid of alcohol. And along with the temperance union, most of those women supported suffrage. So when the issue of voting on women's rights came up, the liquor interests looked at that possibility, and they felt that it was really likely that if women won the vote, they might restrict alcohol sales. And so particularly for California and San Francisco, which was probably in 1896 when they had the first vote, it was the biggest population center in the state, and the hospitality interests were very powerful. And so they opposed it outright, and they put money into campaigns against it. And Susan B. tried to separate the temperance union from the suffrage issue because if you alerted the liquor interests, they could be very powerful anti-voters.
And they had more influence than what was being proposed from the point of view of women's suffrage. So their journey was made a lot harder because of the other challenges that kept coming. Yeah. Of course, California became the sixth state eventually, the sixth Western state to support women's suffrage. But there is a history associated with San Ramon Valley and Contra Costa related to this whole thing. So can you shed some light on that part of history?
Certainly. You know, I was reading the other day about a couple that lived in San Ramon, and they were the Cox family. They lived in North San Ramon, and they had a great big ranch, and they were a place where people would come and have picnics. So we have pictures of people having picnics at Cox's ranch, and they moved there early, and they had 5 daughters. And when they first started talking about suffrage in the county, the man and his wife both became active in suffrage efforts like the 1860s, really early. And I decided, well, that's because they had the daughters. But if you travel along in time, the men voters in our valley were not really enthusiastic about women's suffrage. And when it came to the actual vote in California in 1911, San Ramon supported it by like 1 vote, and Danville overwhelmingly voted against it, like 2-1. And I was so disappointed when I did this research, really, Aparna. I just was insulted by these fellows. And we did have a Danville suffrage club that had women ranchers involved and women business people. And one of the first teachers in our high school was an officer for this club too. So the woman, you know, the women stood right up to it, but the men got into the ballot box and didn't vote for it locally, although it passed in Contra Costa by 21 votes.
And that's, I think, a record-setting vote. So not to create any rift with our lovely northern neighbors, the town of Danville, me being a San Ramon resident, what do you think, speculatively, why was San Ramon at a higher percentage than Danville?
Well, it was barely. But I think one of the reasons, well, no, I actually don't know why. There were more people in Danville, you know, at that point. But I thought that the women campaigners were so reasonable. I have no idea why these men didn't just step right up and vote for it. It's a mystery to me.
Maybe they felt something new is always very threatening and they wanted to step away. Let's talk about, is there anything about the history of women's suffrage in San Ramon Valley that you would like to expand on before I ask the next part of the conversation about our valley's history?
Well, within the valley, I would say we were really very typical in the way we supported the women supported suffrage, and the women who were the leads on it immediately took advantage of voting. And so what I think is really great to see is like the next election that happened, the women came out and voted, and they identified themselves in different ways as merchants, as ranchers, as housewives. And I think the kind of education they had out of one-room school and the high school enabled them to be really good voters.
So I know this is the centennial year celebrations.
Yes.
The pandemic has put a pause on pretty much anything that brings people together. You probably had planned for a huge celebration. How are you going to move forward and still keep this celebration going? Is there something planned virtually?
Well, we have a couple of things. In August, late August is the actual centennial. And so one of the things we're doing at the museum during the Farmers Market on Saturday is having an outdoor museum that talks about the suffrage. And we have something from the National Archives that's really very informative. And we come, several of us come with our masks and social distance and talk about it. So that's one thing we're doing. Fortunately, we were honored by the July 4th parade, and they did a video that showed the exhibit. And what we plan to do on October 20th at 11:30 is have a program on women's suffrage. And we will show the video part of that was done by the Kiwanis, and we'll have a PowerPoint and program and question and answer, because it's the following week that we celebrate the centennial. We also have some great note cards and information and bookmarks that we're giving to people. So that's what we will be doing out of the museum. But I think people ought to keep an eye on the kind of programs that people are having. And there will be a lot of things in August, I'm sure, because this was a very significant event for the country. When you enfranchise half of your population, which was 26 million people, that's an event that is certainly worth celebrating.
And that's also something that we should not take for granted. It was very, very difficult to get to this point, and women should be aware of what the other women did for us to be where we are today. So
Absolutely.
I think that is something our community should be embracing moving forward with the women's suffrage movement and how it evolved.
Mm-hmm.
I know you are an author and an excellent author. I have read your book. So you are in the midst of an yet untitled book, which we will not talk about a whole lot, but I know you're into history. So enlighten us and our viewers on the history of Doherty Valley. What was special? What stood out for you? And anything that residents in Doherty Valley can find interesting.
Okay, I'm happy to say a little word about it because, of course, you look at Doherty Valley and you wonder what that name is, what it meant. And it's named for a man named James Whit Doherty, whose family was Irish. They were Scotch-Irish, and they came to the country in the 1700s back east. And he, of course, came out with the gold rush and was a very enterprising man. I don't know quite how he came to the valley, but in the valley, all of San Ramon was part of a Mexican rancho, Jose Maria Amador's rancho. And people were coming to the gold rush and settling on his rancho because they thought it was available land, and he could not get rid of them. And so he gradually sold parts of his land. He had about 22,000 acres, and Doherty bought 10,000 acres from him. And what Doherty did was he put together a posse of his own people, and he tossed all the squatters off his ranch. And a lot of them were not interested in leaving. So that was the first step that he had. But he ultimately had one of the largest ranches in Northern California and became very prominent in Alameda County. He was a county supervisor for several years in the 60s and had a hotel in Dublin. And when people talked about this area, they always talked about James Whit Doherty.
Because of that land and his settling there. Now I'm going to ask you a question, which is again speculative. You are one of the directors of the East Bay Regional Park District. If you had to go back in time and had access as a park district to 10,000 acres of land, what would the park district do? Would jump for joy?
Well, the park district would say, how much would it cost? And then take a good look at it. We have 123,000 acres now in both Alameda and Contra Costa County and 73 parks. So this area right now, we pretty much have trails that go through. There's the Tassajara Trail. And then we have Morgan Territory, which you can reach going up Finley Road. So having some open space that was permanent parkland is what we provide. And we always appreciate it if the public supports us as we do acquire new parkland.
So the conversation with Jose Amador would have been much different then. It would have been more like, we have to first see what you're giving us, and then the pricing. Anything else about the history of Doherty Valley that is important to our cities, our region's history?
Well, I think it's important for people to remember that the beginnings of the Doherty Valley, because there were debates about should they be developing that area, how many dwelling units, how many houses there should be. And so there was a debate and litigation that went on for probably 5 or 6 years with regard to the number there. San Ramon as a city knew it would ultimately become part of the city. And what they tried to do was have fewer dwelling units, which would be less traffic. The developers wanted more, and they went to the county to receive their approvals. And so that was a very difficult thing for people in San Ramon to accept. But finally, there is an advisory committee as Doherty develops, which San Ramon is a prominent part of. And what happens is once that they are developed, then it comes to the city of San Ramon. So for Doherty, I think for the current Doherty development, I think they have some pretty extraordinary things. They have a wonderful trail system and unbelievable number of parks. So that's not the kind of thing that used to happen 50 years ago. You had to, you were lucky if you got a park. And for Doherty Valley, I'd say that they're well served in all of those lovely parks and trails that they currently have.
Yes, and we are finishing up our last and 18th annexation as per the Doherty Valley Settlement Agreement. So as a historian, as an author, you've seen everything come to fruition essentially in the valley. I mean, you have been a part of this whole history in some shape, way, or form. Do you feel there is anything more to add, accomplish in the next decade or so for you personally, or for the valley, in terms of history, or our parks, anything that residents should be paying attention to?
Well, I always think that that people who live in a community need to pay attention to their own community. Sometimes it's fun to look at national politics and try and understand what the Congress is doing, for goodness sakes, and even California politics, because we are a very large state. But the place where people can have an impact is with their own city and with their own community. I mean, you can go down to the council and talk directly, and you can have an impact. And the people who are elected and who are appointed to commissions, I think sometimes they deal with something that are interesting projects or perhaps controversial projects, and they welcome people coming and talking about them. So for me, the biggest shock now and then has been you're sitting at the dais and you're dealing with an important project, and only 2 people show up in the audience. And I would like to see a habit of involvement in our cities.
Greater participation helps. Look at what happened with women's suffrage. And so do you feel you've accomplished personally for you, you've accomplished what you set out to do, create awareness, and just essentially get the word out about things that you were involved in? Or do you feel there's more to do?
Well, I think there's always more to do. I was very involved in the incorporation of Danville, getting it started. And that was a fascinating experience and reflecting my interests. And then working on the history, I think it's important for our valley to look at the whole valley as their history. We were so tiny for so long. Until World War II, there were probably around 2,000 people in Alamo, Danville, San Ramon, Diablo, Tasajara Valley. And we're a lot larger now, but we share this history, the history of Native peoples and the Spanish and agriculture, which was so important, and then the whole suburban development. And so it's something we share as opposed to have that's entirely different from community to community.
And you've done a fabulous job with everything that you've been involved in, and you are involved in a lot of things. So we really admire and appreciate the work you've put in over the years and in getting things done in our communities. Any parting thoughts, Beverly? This was wonderful to get insights into things that many of us are not aware of. Anything else before we end this?
Well, I'm really focusing on suffrage, this summer, and I think it's as we are looking at Black Lives Matter and people saying perhaps it's time to have different attitudes toward the America that we have, which is multiracial. I think we need to honor the efforts people have made in the past to understand how important our rights are as Americans, and to grant civil rights to all of us, and to vote.
Vote, yes, very important. That was the whole point of this, that remember to exercise your right to vote. A lot of people have put in a tremendous amount of work behind this. So again, not taking anything for granted, not taking our parks for granted, our right to vote, not taking you for granted. I guess that's
Right.
what it is.
Right.
You're bringing history back to life, so we should not be doing that. Thank you so much, Beverly. Really enjoyable conversation, and I wish you the very best on your upcoming book. I know you're still working on it. I don't know how much you could share information on it. Could you? Do you have any
Yes,
information?
what happened last year is several of us from the museum put together a little downtown tour for Alamo, which is not incorporated, and it's an old community in the valley. And when I was then stuck in place, I decided that perhaps this was a time to do a history book on Alamo. And so I am working on that. I've got 14 chapters, and the draft is done. And I've been having, I was telling people, initially you get very enthusiastic about doing something like this, and then you hit the work. So I've been working away at it. The book should be out in the spring, late winter and spring, and that will mean that we have history books about our valley. Ramon has one. There's a new one that's just been done for Diablo. Danville has one. Alamo will have one. And I'm hoping at some point to do at least a long monograph on Doherty Valley that can be shared, particularly out of the Doherty Valley Library.
So essentially, Beverly Lane is not going to slow down. She's going to keep going. Now,
yes, I am. I'm slowing down.
When you were working on this project, on this new book, did you have to speak to a whole lot of residents during the pandemic through Zoom like we are doing right now, or did you get most of it done before?
We at the museum, we have a lot of information on Alamo. And so I started with all of that information, and the newspapers and the Valley Pioneers, which was a weekly for many years in the Valley, and a few interviews, but now I'm going into many interviews. And for the most part, they are on the phone, and some in person at a distance with a mask. So it'll be a composite of available resources and talking to people.
And that's when history comes alive. So we are really thankful that you're doing this. I can't wait to read the book when it's done and out. And until then, I'm sure you're going to find something else to do after the book is done. But I wish you all the best, Beverly. Thank you for taking the time to do this and talk to us. And yes, please admire her sash. It's also the exhibit is at the Museum of the San Ramon Valley. And you are open, right? Part-time, you're not open the whole week? The museum?
We're an indoor museum, so we're not open.
You're not open at all. Are you doing a virtual thing or no?
If people want to go to our website, there are a number of things you can see. It's museumsrv.org. And all we have right now is our outdoor museum on Saturday mornings.
Outdoor museum. Okay, that's the one. Yeah. Okay, so people can go check it out or check out the website and just participate any which way you can. It is our history. It is our land, and we should all be very proud of it and enjoy it. Thank you so much, Beverly. Very enjoyable talking to you. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you for having me.